What we're going to talk about today is over in Genesis chapter 40 and 41, and we're talking about waiting rooms today. Waiting rooms. Waiting rooms of life. If you've ever noticed that some rooms seem to kind of speak for themselves, we walk into a freshly new, decorated nursery, and it's prepared by proud parents, and immediately the room speaks of joy and excitement and anticipation. Or we might enter into a cozy den. There's a cold winter's evening, a large fire in the fireplace, casting shadows, the fire kind of crackling. That kind of invites us into that. It kind of sends out an invitation to come and sit down and enjoy the atmosphere. Maybe you walk into a dining room right before Thanksgiving and you smell all the food, you hear all the conversation that's going around, friendly voices, and it just kind of reverberates a welcome to you. We just kind of recognize rooms as different things, but other rooms are not as nearly as inviting, are they? And some rooms are distinctly lonely, regardless of how many people may be in them. A room can be full and still be a really lonely room. There's a frightened uncertainty there that prevails often, and those are called waiting rooms. And as a pastor, I've spent quite a bit of time in waiting rooms with families in medical institutions. You can experience a full gauntlet of emotions there, can't you? You have a certain group, a person, they may have red, puffy eyes, and the body language just shows the weight that they're carrying, that turmoil or whatever anxiety they may have. There may be others with kind of a hopeful look of anticipation of good news, and whatever's happening there, it's still a different experience when you're in a waiting room. And I think when you think about the statement I made is, regardless of how many people there, it's usually not a pleasant experience in the waiting room. And we have waiting rooms in our lives we end up in, and it may be that you're waiting to start a new era of education or something. It may be that you have health problems and you've been in the waiting room waiting for whatever to happen. I wrote this sermon 2 weeks ago, not anticipating I'd be gone last Sunday. I thought I would be here, and I experienced a waiting room, literally a waiting room. And while I was in the waiting room, I felt horrible. And then I experienced an emergency room, which was as bad. Yeah, have y'all ever noticed, if you've been in an emergency room, they have 5-foot-long beds, and I'm 6 foot tall, and it's horrible, and my feet stick over this far. And one of the ladies, they was carrying me to do some kind of deal, and she said, "I'm sorry our beds are not bigger." I said, "I am too." I'm sliding down it the whole time, but just waiting rooms of life. You may have an illness and you're just in a waiting room. You find yourself today in any number of waiting rooms. And if you think about it, we don't like to wait on anything, do we? We just don't like to wait. I was thinking about that, how much times have changed. We don't want to wait on our food, do we? We don't want to wait on something we order. Isn't next day shipping amazing? You could probably go home after church, could do it right here, get on Amazon, order something. Tomorrow, sometime midday, you'll have it. We don't want to wait. And then we see on there, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 days shipping. Well, it's going to take 3 days. It's like we just don't like to wait on anything. And so whatever our opportunity is, there's an ideal there in Joseph that I think teaches us some critical insights about when we're living in the waiting room, when we visited the waiting room, and we're in that ideal of I'm in a waiting room. Remember Joseph? He's been in a waiting room, hadn't he? We can go over his life again real quick. His brothers hate him. His father shows him his favorite. He lets all the family know. They're jealous. They take him. They throw him in a well. They sell him to these camel guys that are headed to Egypt. They sell him to Potiphar, and he becomes the head of Potiphar's household. Then he's falsely accused. He's thrown into prison. He becomes the head of all the prison, but he's still in the waiting room. we have a great deal of insight to know what his future holds. Most of us know what his future holds, but realize he's living this day by day. And he's in a waiting room. He's placed on the back burner, and then the cupbearer and the baker come in, and they're in prison. He interprets their dream for them, and he's still in the waiting room, but he tells that cupbearer, hey, remember me when you go before the king. Remember me when you go before the king. That's chapter 40, verse 14. He says, but remember me when it is well with you. See, they're in prison when he tells him this. He says to the baker, you're going to be hung. To the cupbearer, you're going to be restored. So he says, if this is true, if this is what happens, if it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. No doubt, I'm sure Joseph had told the cupbearer, here's where I've been, and here's what happened. I'm sure he told him about Potiphar, about Potiphar's wife. The Bible doesn't say that, so don't say the Bible says, but you're talking to a guy in prison. He's telling you the dreams. You're having a discussion with him. I can imagine that he probably said, hey, let me tell you what I'm here for, and what are you here for? And the cupbearer said, well, the Bible doesn't say they even know. They don't know why they're there. I imagine they knew, but the Bible doesn't tell us. So some have suggested, well, that's kind of a lack of faith because Joseph's request. I was thinking about that, placing confidence in men rather than in God. Excuse me, we talk about how Joseph always had his eyes upon God, and I don't know if that's the prophet or not, but at times the strongest person can waver, can't they? Even with their trust in God, that strongest person can still waver, can still question. I was thinking about that, and if you look at the Bible, you remember the prophet Elijah? I mean, he stands up in front of Jezebel and destroys all the prophets of Baal. What's the next thing we see him doing? Just praying that he can just die. God, just let me die. He sank down in despair. Even his trust in God, he just said, let me die. And then John the Baptist, he's confined to Herod's prison. John the Baptist sends a message out that said, is this really the Christ? The one he proclaimed is the Christ. He began to waver. Is this Jesus really the Christ indeed? And so there are times that when we begin to wait on God, when we begin to in the waiting room, sometimes we openly hint or give our needs to somebody to just say, can you help me? Is there anything you can do for me? That doesn't mean we don't trust God. There's just times that we waver. And that's the case, I think. We often get in a period of times when things don't work out like we wish. In verse 23 of chapter 4, it says, yet the chief cupbearer, or the chief butler, did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. So 2 weeks ago, we left Joseph. He's alone in prison. He's been there 2 years now. The cupbearer has forgotten all about him. Nothing's up. And then in Genesis 41:1, we read, then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. And this 2 full years, as far as we know, they weren't exciting. They weren't eventful. If you're doing something that's really fun, really exciting, time flies, doesn't it? I mean, you'll look down and think, man, it's already, teachers, y'all are going to be out in 21 days, is that right? Something like that. For the summer, I mean, you'll have to work some of the summer, but what are you going to do in July or August? You're going to go, God, that's just flew by, But if you sat in the waiting room for 3 months, you're going to think, God, is this ever going to end? I mean, so the circumstances we're in, they really kind of determine how long it seems. And for Joseph, we don't read anything, no exciting events, no interpreting dreams, nothing that would say, well, it made his time go faster. It was just a long, dull monument. Is that what you call what is it when it's just mundane, some of y'all may say, oh, Lord, just like this service we're in right now. I mean, it's dragging on and on. We just got started, folks. So that's what we see. We see that in Joseph's life. And a lot of times when we end up in that period of waiting, nothing seems to happen. You just wait and wait and wait. And you begin to say, God, where are you in this process, and why am I in this situation? But there are several thoughts I want you to see this morning with me as we think about how to successfully deal with delay. How to successfully deal with those times that we're just in a time of waiting. The New Testament tells us in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, Behold, O beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened to you. I mean, through the direction of the Holy Spirit, Peter writes that. Don't think it's strange concerning the trial that you get in, like it's something new, like it's something that's just happening to you. You know, if you read through any of the books of the Bible, you see that the saints had to deal with disappointment all the time. I mean, that's what they had to deal with, those following Christ. Think about Abraham. He had to wait for a decade for a promised son. That God said, you're going to have a son, and he's going to be the promised son. I give you this truth. And then he waited for years and years and years to the point he said, I ain't going to have no kid. I'm too old. And Sarah said, yeah, you're too old. We're not going to have any kids. But God was still there. But Abraham was just in the waiting room. Think about Moses. For 40 years, Moses is in the wilderness. He's waiting. He knows he's a man of God. He knows God has something for him. But here he is just in a time of waiting. For 40 years he waits in the desert. This is for you to be awake. Where's he headed with the children of Israel? Oh, y'all jump out there, you know that. The promised land, right? God promised them a land. It's a great land flowing with milk and honey and big clusters of grapes and all the things they can imagine. It's going to be a great time. They're headed there. 40 years, Moses is in the waiting room. Then he gets them out of Egypt, and what happens? 40 more years. He's in the desert again. 80 years. He's moving towards the promised land. You know what? God is developing. God is, and you know the reason of that, disobedience of Israel, and they went around the mountain and around the mountain and around the mountain, and finally a whole generation died. And it was time to move into the promised land. Don't forget, Moses didn't go into the promised land because he was disobedient to God, but he remained faithful. So look at Joseph here. Joseph may have felt like he had a roller coaster of life. I mean, if you just look at where he's at so far, he's there because of injustice. Maybe we're in a waiting room because we were unjustly accused. He's there, maybe he don't feel like he got the credit he deserves. We don't always feel like we got the credit we deserve. I deserve more credit for that. You know, life can be a struggle. Life can be tough. Life can be difficult. Again, the favorite son, foreign land, Pharaoh's top man, Potiphar's top man, all of these things, overseer of the prison, but he's still in the waiting room. So don't be surprised when you're in the waiting room. Don't jump up and say, God, why have you got me here? Yeah, you can say that, but no, it's not strange. We all end up in waiting rooms occasionally. Here's the second thing. We experience delays. We need to learn to just trust in God. Now, I want to tell y'all something. I'll tell you in a minute. So Jeremiah 17:5 says, Thus saith the Lord, cursed is the man. Listen to this. The United States need to hear this too. You know, we have a Savior, and that's Jesus Christ. And our world's in a mess. And we don't put our trust in men. We put our trust in God. And Jeremiah says, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength. I read that, and I was like, wow, that's kind of deep to me. I'm pretty shallow, so it might not be deep to y'all, but that's kind of deep to me, you know. Cursed is the man who trust in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord, for he shall be like a shrub planted in the desert, and it's not seen when the good comes, but it shall inhabit the parched place in the wilderness, in a salt land which is not inhabited. And what Jeremiah is saying, you know, when we begin to look at ourselves and we're in a waiting room, we sometimes forget to trust God. And remember, you know, God is still in control. God is still moving. I'm in a bad spot. I'm in a waiting room, but we need to trust God and God alone. That's who we trust in. You know, Joseph's life was not all fluctuation and change. You know, if you look and study Joseph as we've been doing, you'll see the one shining thing that was constantly in Joseph's life, and that was his priority, that he gave God first priority. That was his life. I mean, we see that constant in his whole life. Wherever his situation, whatever waiting room was in, he was always giving God first priority. I'm sure he had questions. I think sometimes I'm kind of guilty of reading these things and thinking, yeah, you know, he was just a man of God, you know, and he didn't have to struggle like we have to struggle. That's not true. If we're born again, we're children of God, and we still have struggles. We still have tough times. And, you know, the prophet Isaiah 44:21 reveals that God has promised, you will not be forgotten by me. That's a promise from God. He's not going to forget us. He's not going to put us in prison and then not think of us anymore. Now, in Joseph's life, we know that because we know what the outcome is. But when we're in the waiting room, sometimes it's easy for us to forget during deep sorrow, during distress, that God has not left us. He's not abandoned us. He's not forsaken us. And we need to learn to trust in God alone. When we find ourselves in a waiting period, we need to maybe see what God's trying to teach us. What's God trying to teach me in this waiting room? We find ourselves, there's two things I think we can ask. The first is there something God's trying to teach me during this time of waiting? What is God trying to teach me? What should I be learning during this time of waiting? There's a story about a French engineer who he's traveling on the Mediterranean Sea with a stranger. A stranger on the ship became sick. It was a contagious disease, resulting that the ship that was traveling would have to be quarantined. The confinement, it says, was terrible, and I'll butcher up these names, but that's okay. Delesseps, I think, Delesseps was the guy's name. So he began to pass time. He said, I've got to do something to pass time. You know, when you're in a waiting room, just anything to help pass time. You know, you'll pick up a Better Homes and Garden and read about growing lilies. You know, I mean, just anything to pass the time. Well, this is what he did. He picked up a book that were the memoirs of Charles Leadapere, who had studied the feasibility of building a canal from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So he's just reading notes that this guy had written. I mean, that sounds really boring to me. But after he read that volume, and despite that he was detained for all of those days, he began to devise a plan. He was an engineer, and he devised a plan to build the Suez Canal. And he did all that while he was in the waiting room, while he was in a waiting period. It was completed in 1869, so that quarantine waiting room resulted in an experience that later would prove immensely valuable to the world. And so we can ask ourselves, is God trying to show me something? Is God trying to teach me something? What's God trying to show me during this time of waiting? Secondly, I think we need to ask, is there something God's attempting to change in my life during this time? Is God trying to change something? Is God trying to mold me in something? I don't know about you, but, you know, I think sometimes we waste a lot of time in the waiting room. We get in the waiting room of life and we just don't ask the right questions. We just sit and think, where is God in all of this? Now, this is the story I was going to tell you, and I hope I don't bore you with stories about myself sometimes. I, by no means, am trying to brag that I'm a super spiritual guy, but we've been studying our Sunday school with our youth. We've studied nearly all the young folks in the Bible. I mean, we've looked at Esther, and we've looked at Joseph, and we've looked at a lot of the young people that God has used, and over and over. And then I got to thinking, in probably the last 6-8 months in our messages on Sunday, we've been talking about, you know, being patient and where are we at in life, and God has a plan, and God's moving forward. And I made a statement one time, you know, even when Elijah, we studied Elijah, you know, and he went before the king. And y'all remember, he went to court before the king. He said, it's not going to rain till I say it's going to rain. That's bold, isn't it? Isn't that bold? God said that's going to happen. You go tell the king. But when he got before the king, he had to go, it's not going to rain anymore. And then God came back and said, all right, it's time for it to rain, Elijah. Go tell the king it's going to rain. How much faith did that take? I mean, for Elijah to go back, the king's been looking to get him, okay? He's been hiding out all this time. To walk up before the king and said, hey, in a couple of days it's going to rain. Doesn't that take faith? The Bible says the sun's shining bright, there's not a cloud in the sky. And Elijah said, it's going to rain. And I thought about, and we talked about how much faith did that have to say, God said it, and I believe it, and that settles it. And I'm going to go and walk by faith on what God says. Now, let me tell you how that applies to my life. I've been preaching that, I've been teaching that, but I hadn't been living that. Because I think, and I was praying, and I'll just give y'all a quick synopsis of what happened. My liver, the drain, I'm going to use a bunch of medical terms because I don't know them. The drain that goes from your liver that takes all the impurities and drops it into your intestines, it stopped up. It did that back last year, and since June of last year, I had no trouble. Well, I went in 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago. They said, Al, we're going to have to put a tube back in there. Well, they got in there, and it was stopped up so bad they couldn't push the tube through it. It's scar tissue. So they said, well, we're going to just leave it kind of sitting in there, and it'll work a little bit, and then we'll look in a couple of weeks or a month what we're going to do. Well, somehow it slid out, you know. Denise, when she gets mad at me, she grabs that tube and goes, come here. Oh! So I think she jerked it out a little bit. So I got infection. That's why I had to go to the hospital. At the hospital, I was thinking, well, I was in a waiting room. I mean, I just did not want to go there. I'm thinking I've got all these summer activities planned. This is the last place in the world I want to be. Well, I've been praying that the main thing is they get that tube through there, because if they could get it through there, they go all the way through, all the way to your intestines, and that way there's a tube that helps drain it all, and then you're not going to get sick. In a couple of weeks, they're going to decide what they're going to do permanently, but the doctor came in. I'm laying there fixing to go back for the procedure, and he said, well, we're going to, on the pictures, it looks like the drain has slid back. We don't know how that happened. I said, I know how it happened. Why? You know. And he said, we're going to just try to get it fixed back in there, and we're going to leave it, and we're going to see what happens. And the whole time, I was thinking, I need to tell him that it's going. But I couldn't. I thought, God, how embarrassing will that be to say, no, it's going to go this time, because I've been praying about it. So I thought, I'm not going to say anything. And he talked to me a little bit. He said, got any questions? Doggone, I was thinking, man, I've told the youth to do this. I've asked the church to do this. I've preached about this, but I'm just not living it. So I said, well, it's going all the way through. He went, okay, we're going to do our best. And I said, no, it's going through. I've been praying about it. I feel like it's going through. And he said, okay, we're just going to do our best. And I said, all right, you do your best. Well, they took me in there, and they said, we're going to give you something to relax you. What did they give me? Denise was amazed. Fentanyl, whatever, and something else. And I did not go to sleep. I was laying there, and he's like, he put a shot in there to deaden, and I was like, that hurt. And he's like, okay. And so it's on a big old screen, bigger, that big. They're looking through a camera, you know. So I just turned around like this and started looking at the camera, and he's putting that thing up through there, and I can see it. And I went, oh, that hurt. And he said, give him some more. He looked at the nurse. So she got this deal and went, you know, in my IV. And I said, oh, that hurt again. And he looked at me and said, we're getting to that spot right now. So I'm having a conversation with this guy. And I thought my liver was way down here. It's way up here. But it's hurting right here, you know. And I'm like, oh, it hurts right there. And the nurse said, I'll give him some more. He can give me some more. And I'm like, that stuff's not doing any good. You're not going to put me to sleep this time. You know, normally people say that and you're out like that. So I'm looking, and just all of a sudden, on that screen. I couldn't tell what it was exactly, but I could see my liver, I guess. It just went, whew, man, I seen all them veins open up. And he went, we got through. And I said, I told you was going to. And then they put a balloon in there and started stretching it. And I was like, that hurt. And he finally said, we're just going to give you a break. So they didn't give me any more fentanyl, but if I ever have to get high, I'm not going to use fentanyl because it just wakes me up. You know, it makes me talk a whole time. So, but I know the doctors are aggravated because I talked to them the whole time. But you know, sometimes we just got to step out in faith and say, look, God's going to do this. I don't know how. I don't know why. I just know he said he's going to do this, so we got to trust. And I think that's where Joseph was. I think Joseph said, God, I don't understand why I'm here. I don't understand. I've got all of these things planned this summer, and I got all these activities to do, and things are really going good. Why am I back here? Why am I back in here? And God said, you know what? I haven't left you. Just take a step. Just move. You may say, oh, it's so tiny, but for me it wasn't. It was a gamble that I wanted the doctors to know, look, I believe there's a higher power than you at work here, and God delivered that. So when we're in those waiting room times, God, what are you trying to teach me? God, is there something that you want to change in my life? Some way I can grow, some way I can start walking by faith, quit talking by faith and begin to walk by faith, quit trusting myself and start trusting in you. And I think that's where Joseph was, and I think that's the lesson for us. And next, when the fourth thing, when we find ourselves in the waiting period, we need to wait on God's timing. God has timing for us, and it says, then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. This is what that girl read a while ago, Elise, it came to the end of full 2 years that Pharaoh had a dream. Behold, there stood before them the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 big, fine-looking, fat cows. They fed there on the meadow. And behold, Jake's cows came up, gauntly and thin and ugly, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly, gauntly cows ate up the 7 fat cows. And Pharaoh woke up, and then he fell asleep again in a dream a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain come up on a stalk, plump and full and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads came up, blighted by the east wind, and sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump heads full of grain. So Pharaoh awoke indeed, and it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. He called for all the musicians and all the people of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but none of them were able to interpret the dream for Pharaoh. So the king had a dream. In his dream, he sees these fat cows, and then he sees these old scrawny cows, and they eat up the fat cows. Then he sees the grain, and then the old nasty-looking grain comes up, and it covers up all those things. So he's troubled about it. He probably recognizes there's some similarities in these 2 dreams. You know, there's a series of 7s followed by a second series of 7 in both of his dreams. You know, the 7 cows, then the other 7 cows, then the 7 grain, then the other 7 grain. And so it's kind of notable that set of 7s in each of his dreams devoured the prosperity of the other ones. So I'm sure he's confused. He's thinking, what could this mean? What could it be? And then in verses 9, the cupbearer says, I remember my faults this day. So he says, I remember a promise I made a guy. I remembered my faults this day. Verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, which had a dream that night, he and I both, and each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, verse 12 said, now there was a young Hebrew man who was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted it according to his own dream, and it came to pass just as he had interpreted it for us. So it happened, and he restored me to my office, and he hanged him. He hanged the bread maker, the baker. So the guy said, hey, I remember I made a promise to a guy, and he interpreted a dream, and he told me, I'm going to come out of prison, I'm going to be back by your side, but you're going to hang the bread guy. And it came to pass just like he said. So when we find ourselves in a waiting period, remember what God, we choose to respond differently at different times. when we're in that waiting room, you know, that we choose how we're going to respond at different times. Then Pharaoh sent, this is 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, he changed his clothes, and he came to Pharaoh. I think it's interesting when we think about Joseph is walking by faith. I think this is a good lesson for me. He's walking by faith. He realizes that God is moving. He's kind of moved out of the waiting room. He's moved more into what God has for him. As he comes out of the dungeon, he didn't just go face Pharaoh. They didn't say, come on, hurry up, he wants to see you. It says that he shaved his face, changed his clothing. Now, that wasn't a matter of getting cleaned up. That wasn't a matter of just saying, I want to make myself presentable. That may have been part of it, but it was a cultural concession. Okay? It had nothing to do with a concession with God. It was simply saying, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fit more into your culture, but I'm not going to compromise on my relationship with God. And what I mean by that is, in the Hebrews, a beard was a mark of dignity, okay? But in Egyptians, it was offensive for folks to have a beard. So what Joseph did, he said, I'm going to go before the king. I'm going to make myself presentable to the king in his culture. So, you know, the Bible teaches that God meets us where we are. He meets us where. That's what Joseph did. He didn't say, I'm going to compromise on my relationship with God. I'm going to bow to his gods. I'm going to do anything to get out of prison. He simply said, I want to meet him where he's at. I want to show him that I'm willing to meet him. I'm willing to meet him on level ground. And that's what he did. And then in verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. There's no one can interpret it, but I have heard said, listen, that you can understand this dream and that you can interpret it. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, I understand you the man. You're the man, you can do it. I've already heard about it. I know you're the man that can do it. When he's called upon to interpret dreams, I'm sure he had to remember his old dreams of when he was 17 years old and how he told everybody. And it seems like every time he used his gift, he helped the cupbearer and the baker out, and he used his gift that God had given him, and it had backfired on him. But this time, I think it's significant that Joseph's first and foremost concern was God. It was God. You know, when he's in prison, he tells those guys, hey, I'll interpret these for you if you want me to. So he did, but that's what he did 2 years earlier. But this time, look in verse 16 of chapter 41. He said, it's not in me. It's not me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I think that's interesting. Joseph has been in prison. Pharaoh says, I know you're the guy that can do this. And he goes, no, I can't do it. I can't help you, but you know what? God will give you the answer. And it's impressive to me, in verse 16, he said, it's not me, God will provide Pharaoh an answer of peace. In verse 16, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. In verse 25, this thing is established by God, and God is about to do it. So we see that how he responded was this, it's all about God. It's not about me, Pharaoh. It's not about my interpretation. It's all about God. He didn't take any credit. He didn't take any accommodations. He didn't waver on his theological belief. He didn't do any of those things. He met Pharaoh where he's at, and he said, you're wanting these interpretations, and God is going to answer you. I think when we get in those times of waiting room, we think about, you know, God is the one. God's the one that's going to answer. God's the one that's going to move. God's the one that's going to heal. Not only did Joseph interpret his dreams, he said, this is what it means. He means, and we know this probably, it's going to be 7 years of good times and 7 years of famine. And those two examples, that's what it is. For 7 years, Egypt is going to be blessed. They're going to have more in abundance than you need. And then for 7 years, there's going to be a drought. There's going to be a famine. It's going to be great within the land. So as Joseph interpreted those dreams, he says, God's doing all this, and let me tell you, you better get somebody that can head it up. He didn't say, I'm your man. He said, this is part of the dream. You better get somebody that can head this stuff up because you're going to have to make preparations. In 33, Pharaoh said, what we need to do as soon as possible, find a discerning wise man, or this is Joseph talking, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt, and appoint commissioners over the land, and take 1/5 of all the grain from the farmers each harvest during the 7 good years. May it be used during the 7 years of famine, that the nation will not be ruined by the famine. So it's my own belief that Joseph did not give advice for this, that he would be in that position. I think he simply said, this is what God is saying, this is what God is going to do. If I'm you, this is what I would do, and this is what God says. You need to set aside some things for the future, and you better find somebody that can head that up. 41:37 says, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of Pharaoh's servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man, and a man who is in the... Let me read that again. Can we find such a one as this, a man whom is the Spirit of God? In him is the Spirit of God. Here's Pharaoh. He serves false gods. He serves foreign gods. He doesn't worship the one true God. But he recognized something in Joseph's life that said, hey, this guy is full of the Spirit of God. The way he's responded, the way he's answered, the way he's done, how he's been in prison. I'm sure Pharaoh had been filled in on all of those other details. He said, this guy is full of the Spirit of God. In verse 39, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning, as wise as you. You shall be over my house, over all my people, and shall rule according to your own word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So do you understand what he said? He said, man, you are my right-hand guy. You have as much authority as everything I have except for the throne. You're going to be the man in charge. I think, when Pharaoh says that he was wise in understanding, that expression is only used to one other person, and that's Solomon. The Bible says the wisest guy in the world. So God said that the king was wise in understanding. He understood what God is doing. Joseph understood. He was wise in understanding. And because of that, God had a plan for him. To the casual observer, you might say, well, it's just a coincidence that things happened. It's just a coincidence that thing happened to go through 2 weeks later. I mean, it's just a coincidence. It's just, the doctors messed up. I don't believe that. I believe God has divine appointments for us. I believe God places us in situations. He places us in place and time that we might grow, that we might be used by God, and that others may see what God is doing in our life. That's what we see in the life of Joseph. We see that a lot of times we get in the waiting room, we want to debate God, we want to ask God, we want to dictate God. This is what my circumstances should be, all the way to the hospital last week. I said, all right, God, this is what I need to be doing. This is where I need to be going. This is not where I need to be. But only until I said, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to live what I've been saying, and I'm going to believe that you're going to have this under control. I believe at that point is when we realize we're where God would have us to be. I want to ask you to bow your heads. We've gone over about 5 minutes, but I want to ask you to bow your heads, and we're not going to have an invitation this morning. If God is moving in your heart, I'll be here after the service. You can catch me. We're going to be eating this morning. You can go out and join a meal, and we can talk together. But, we should be living in a way, and I should be living in a way that an unbelieving world can see that there is a God and that we trust in Him. That's not that we're going out and standing on the corner and preaching. That's fine. But living a life in such a way that others recognize, hey, there is a God, and that girl, that guy, that person believes, and I can see it in their life. Father, I pray today that we would realize that when we're in life's waiting rooms, when we're in trials and difficult situations, we're not in the beauty of a den lit up with a fire, but we're in the waiting room wondering what the next step is, Lord. I pray that we would realize that you're faithful, that we all go through tough times. Father, that you never leave us, you don't forsake us, you don't abandon us, but Father, we can walk with you step by step, and you order our steps, Father. I pray that when we're in those waiting rooms, we would ask ourselves, God, what are you trying to teach me this time? Or God, what are some things I need to change in my life? And Father, that we could come out growing through a time of waiting. Father, I pray this morning that your Spirit would make clear the words that you'd have for us, Lord. I pray that the foolishness of what I've said, Father, would be nothing. But, Lord, that your Spirit would give us wisdom, would give us understanding and application in our lives, Lord. I thank you for this day. I thank you for this church. I thank you for my brothers and sisters in Christ, the love that we have. Lord, I pray that we would walk in your ways, that you would direct our steps, and that you would be glorified in our lives. And I pray this in the name of Jesus.